Hello, everyone. Thanks for attending the second webinar of our series of 4 on mathematical modeling of the power duration relationship while cycling. Today we have Dr. Andrew Coggan. He's going to be going through a presentation. He'll be doing all of the speaking today. As Dr. Coggan is going through, if you have a question, please submit it in the question box. So we are going to be monitoring the questions, and we're going to leave a little bit of time at the end for him to answer them. So please don't wait until the very end to ask your questions. Also, if you're having any technical issues or if you want to ask me a question, you can do that in the question box as well. And one last thing, if you have not already, if you can just mute your phone, that would help with our audio quality. So this will be recorded. You'll be able to watch it. We'll post it on YouTube and send an email out to everyone. And you also will have access to the slide set. So that will probably happen at some point tomorrow. So look out for an email on that, and we'll let you all know when it's available. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Dr. Coggan. Take it away.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you all out there in webinar land for attending part 2 of our 4-part series here on the power duration model. That's an important new feature of WKO4. If you were with us last week, you probably remember this slide, and if you weren't with us last week, I'll go through it very, very quickly. But the overall point was that there's lots of interesting new ideas that we have implemented or hope or plan to implement in future versions of WKO4 and beyond, but they're all predicated upon having a very robust mathematical description of the power duration relationship, what more colloquially I guess is known as the mean maximal power curve. First meeting I talked about but again, just to remind you, there are various statistical criteria that can be used to look at different aspects of a mathematical model, and remembering that mathematical models are theoretical constructs that may or may not have a basis in reality. They're simply a numerical description of the observable data. What that means is that, as George Box put it, all models are wrong. The question is whether they're usefully wrong. Or, as I've always put it, coming at it from a compartmental modeling perspective in the tracer world, it was more a question of not whether models are right or wrong, but really what is their domain of validity. A rather limited model only works over a small all the way out to the extreme edge cases. But in evaluating models, like I said, there are statistical criteria that can be used, but the real workhorse is really just looking at the residuals. How well does your fitted function agree with the observed data in terms of the distribution of those residuals? That is the difference between the predicted and measured value at any particular, in this case, time point, the overall magnitude of them, and whether or not they're biased. In theory, if your model is good, then the average residual should be 0. Sometimes you err a little high, sometimes you err a little low, but that isn't always the case. You can also look at the precision of the parameter estimates from your model. Well, I'm jumping ahead there. You can look at the number of parameter estimates. You can always get a better fit if you throw in more parameters, but you can also over-parameterize a model where you have multiple parameters that representing what is really one thing, and they end up highly correlated with one another. And that relates then to looking at their independence. And then finally, even if you have a well-structured model in terms of the equations that you're using, you still may or may not get very precise estimates of a particular parameter depending on how much noise there might actually be in the data. On the other hand, if the model is misspecified, even the cleanest data in the world, you wouldn't necessarily be able to get a very precise estimate of a particular parameter. And then finally, what we've done a lot of work around here in the cardiovascular imaging laboratory is external validation. comparing your model predicted values against some sort of gold standard. And last week, I started to try and illustrate these concepts by talking about the classic critical power model. And I'm going to be using this same raw data that you see here in the dots to illustrate the general notion of the various curve fits throughout the discussion tonight. But the critical power model postulates that your power at any particular time t is a function of some critical power plus a work capacity, W prime, sometimes referred to as anaerobic work capacity, divided by time. What you end up with then is a right rectangular hyperbola on a linear plot. And you'll notice at the top of the screen here, I've subscripted this as CP 1 to 10. And that's because, although in theory, the critical power model should be independent of the data upon which you base the calculations, the reality is, as you can sort of see from the shape of that curve, it's an imperfect description of the entire envelope of data available to us, and hence the exact value you get depends upon the numbers that you choose to feed into the calculation. So it's really, in order to aid in communication, it's probably should always be superscripted to indicate the range of durations over which the numbers have been calculated. And efforts in laboratory studies, efforts or tests in the 1 to 10 minute range are maybe 1 to 12 minute range, or 2 to 13 minute range. In that range in general has been pretty much the gold standard, or at least the normal approach, is to use fairly short duration efforts and then do the calculations of critical power and W prime. Well, that's a pretty typical curve fit when you're trying to apply this model to field data, cyclists in the wild. And as you might imagine, while you might do an okay job of fitting through the middle portion of the curve, the model breaks down at very short durations because in fact it predicts, or the equations are postulated on the idea that they're at infinitely short time, power is infinitely high. And it also breaks down at longer durations because it is specified in such a way that your power declines to some critical power which you can maintain forever. And so you end up with a plateau here. So not surprisingly then, if you take this model, fit it to a lot of power duration data from a number of cyclists and look at the normalized residuals, as a very astute young guy I know once put it, it works for a while. And that is, your residuals are pretty tight and they overlap zero as you would want them to through the small range of the total durations, but they're high, and in fact infinitely high at very short durations, and then they become progressively higher at very long durations. So the critical power model, again, it's a pretty simple model, and that's the appeal to it, but its domain of validity is relatively limited. This is a correlation matrix for the parameters to assess their independence, and the good news is that they are completely independent of each other. So no problem in that regard. The model doesn't seem to be over-parameterized, at least. But when you actually go in and look at the values you get for the two parameters, critical power and W prime, and then try and compare them against some sort of gold standard, if you're using very short duration efforts to calculate things, you end up missing the mark. Now, I would hold that if you're looking for a power that can, quote, be maintained for a very long time without fatiguing, or a quasi-steady state power, then your power during a reasonably long time trial is a very good representation of such. But you can see if you calculate critical power using efforts of 1 to 10 minutes in duration, you end up overestimating somebody's true sustainable power output. And pardon me while I catch up on my own little notes here. The intercept here of this regression equation is not statistically different from 0, but the slope is significantly different from 1. Whereas ideally, you'd want all of those blue points to be clustering around that dashed line, which represents the line of identity. That is where critical power and TT power are identical. So this is not news. I mentioned this when I brought the critical power model to the attention of the Waters list back in 2003. And in fact, I also made the suggestion back then of, in order to try and improve upon at least our ability to predict what somebody could in the field, I suggested using longer duration efforts to solve the model, even though that runs contrary to what has historically been done in scientific studies. Sorry, getting ahead of myself here. So with that by way of review and setup from last week, tonight we're going to talk about the limitations of current models, critical power and beyond, using the tools that we talked about, looking at residuals, looking at correlation matrices of parameters estimates, looking at how well the model actually predicts somebody's particular sustainable power output in terms of their time trial power, etc. And the models that I've picked to talk about here, CP 3 to 30, so the same model as I just showed you, but instead basing things on the 3-minute to 30-minute time window, as I suggested back in the chapter I wrote for USA Cycling Coaching Manual at Sam Callan's behest back in, whatever it was, 2003. There is a 3-parameter critical power model that's been proposed by Morton back in 1995. We'll talk about that. Last year at ACSM, Dave Martin, Jim Martin, and I think it's Ken Barnes presented an abstract with another model of the power duration relationship. So I'll be showing you the results from that one. Ward Smith is a paper from also the actually mid-80s, mid-90s, can't remember which, in which they were actually looking at running performance, so we'll talk about that. And then finally, Pinot and Grappe have put forth, it's not really a model, but a mathematical equation. Now, I didn't pick these models for any particular reason in seeking that holy grail of a robust mathematical description of the entire power duration relationship, which is what I need as a foundation to build my Parthenon to power-based training upon. I looked at a lot of models, not just these. I think I evaluated over a dozen. But I'm not going to bore you with giving you all of those and beat you over the head with all of them. This is more like a representative sampling thereof to give you an idea of what's out there and what the limitations are. So for starters, as I jumped ahead of myself as I'm wont to do, when I suggested to people that they may want to look at the critical power model, knowing that it overestimates your sustainable power output, I suggested that people again run against the grain of most of the scientific literature and focus on longer duration efforts, knowing, for example, that you cannot really utilize all of your anaerobic energy reserves in just 1 minute. It doesn't make sense to include such short efforts in the modeling process, etc. So I suggested people focus on 3 to 30, and then subsequent to that, this is what was built into Race Day and what additionally was built into Golden Cheetah, although Golden Cheetah has now reverted to, in essence, a best effort detecting algorithm that ends up almost invariably using something right around 1 minute and something right around 10 to 11 minutes to do the calculations. So it's actually gone backwards in that regard. The red line here is, again, the same data set, and it's the same equation, but it just shows you the solution to the model if you choose to use the 3 to 30-minute data to fit it instead of the 1 to 10-minute data. And in essence, what you do is you just slide your curve, your elbow, a little further down and a little further off to the right. Of course, that's really, although it does give you a better estimate of sustainable power, which is why I made that suggestion initially, in terms of trying to fit the entire power duration relationship. It is, as I put it on Twitter recently, it's just kicking the can a little bit further down the road. So here are the normalized residuals, again, fit to a large data set using 3 to 30-minute values, and they are quite tight in the mid-range there, from somewhere a little over 2 minutes out to probably 20 minutes. But again, the model predicts that at short durations, infinite power can be produced, and that there's some power that can be maintained forever and ever. So the model blows up outside of a relatively narrow domain of validity. Yeah, well, at least they are independent parameters. Still, simply changing the duration over which you do the calculations doesn't solve the problem of the model structure and the limitations it has, at least for the purposes that I wish to have a good model of the power duration relationship. Works fine for if you use longer durations, if all you're interested in doing is estimating somebody's FTP, but we want to do a lot more than just that. Here's an example of, talking about trying to estimate power. The same data set showed before, only in this case it's critical power calculated 3 to 30-minute. The correlation coefficient is better, but now the slope is still significantly different from 1, and the intercept is significantly different from 0. So it's a little bit biased. Not a huge amount, but it's biased. All right, well, okay, so simply changing the duration over which we calculate critical power or calculate or apply the critical power doesn't solve the problem. What other options are out there? Well, in 95, Morton proposed a 3-parameter critical power model. It's easier to understand and view the equations when they're written to solve for time at a fixed power output as opposed to solve for power at a fixed time. But there's what you get when you do the algebra. And there's a curve fit, and you can see right away that forcing the curve to bend over and hit the y-intercept, at least on this one particular individual, would seem to really help things a lot. But when you apply it to a bunch of subjects, what you can see is, yeah, on average, the residuals are overlapping 0, but there does seem to be some sort of funkiness going on here in that they trend under 0 and then back up above and then back down below, these kind of waves here, before finally leveling off a little bit. And we still have the problem that at longer durations, it predicts there's some power that can be maintained for an infinite period of time. You also have to wonder if the model might be either over-parameterized or perhaps misspecified, in the sense that the correlation coefficients that you see in red bold there are statistically significant at 0.05 level. So critical power and Pmax, yeah, it's not a strong correlation even though it's statistically significant, but Pmax and W prime are highly correlated with one another. Now, you could make the argument, especially since I'm dealing in watts here and not watts per kilogram, you could make the argument that this is a real relationship, that people who tend to have high maximal powers and are big people also have high W primes, and that's certainly a possibility. But at the same time, that's a pretty strong correlation, and you wonder if you really are separating the two, if you're really modeling different things or not. And then finally, if you then look at the correlation again, trying to predict somebody's sustainable power, our slope is still significantly different from 1. Our intercept is significantly different from 0. And our correlation coefficient here has actually gone down. So not quite as good a fit between the two. I should, passing thought there that I should point out. I don't know what it was. Sorry about that. So the 3-parameter model, at first blush, it looks like it's going to be our salvation, but in reality, it's not a fantastic improvement. It is an improvement over just using 2 parameters, but it's not the solution that I was seeking when I was off evaluating models. So what's a person to do? Well, we got to press on, dig deeper into the literature, and see what else might be out there. This is the model that I was talking about, developed by AIS and presented at ACSM. And you can see it's a pretty complicated formula there, but basically it's hypothesizing that you have 2 W prime reserves, one of which is being depleted as a function of time, and one of which in the simple model, and then really this second term ends up modifying the original power duration, or sorry, critical power model. It doesn't look very good in this plot, and no, I did not pick this to try and make the model look bad. That's simply how it fits. The evaluation I saw was on a linear time scale, and in fact it was a fairly limited number of laboratory-based efforts, and the correlation coefficient when you're fitting just 5 or 6 or 7 durations, as I recall, with at least 4 adjustable parameters, looked really great. So it looked like it described the power duration relationship quite nicely, at least in the 5-second to 10-minute range. But if you look beyond those time points and you try and apply the model to field-derived data as opposed to formal laboratory-based tests, it doesn't look quite so good, as you can see here. There are the normalized residuals. Clearly the model is biased. It overestimates power at very short durations. It overestimates power at longer durations, and it underestimates power in between. And there's also quite a bit of correlation going on between the various parameters. Actually, I mislabeled this slide. I apologize. This should say correlation matrix for the AIS model, because obviously there's more than 3 parameters there. There's 4, right? But you can see a lot of correlation coefficients are lighting up in red, and it makes you want to, it certainly starts to raise questions as to whether or not the model is correctly specified, or really you have interdependent parameters here representing one thing as if it's 2 separate things when it's not really. And finally, when you try to look at the correlation between the model-derived estimate of critical power and somebody's sustainable time trial power, we finally get to the point that the intercept is not significantly different from 0 and the slope is not significantly different from 1, but notice that the R² here is quite a bit poorer than the earlier fits. There's a lot more scatter. So it doesn't seem to be biased in underestimating or consistently underestimating or consistently overestimating somebody's sustainable power output, which is what critical power is supposed to represent, right? A power that can be maintained for a very long time without fatiguing because of the underlying physiology. On average, it does okay, but on any given individual case, not so good. And that brings us on to a model proposed by Ward Smith, where stepping away from the notion of W prime as some reserve of work that can be done, instead modeling your power at any particular time as a function of a decay from Pmax and a rise to critical power. So there's no work term in here. Instead, it's hypothesized that your anaerobic power output starts out at Pmax and then decays with this exponential function, and that your critical power starts out at 0 and increases to a plateau via an exponential function, and the time constant is the same here, so the same tau. This is appealing in the sense of you could, if you understand how physiology works, you could certainly justify the notion that declining anaerobic energy turnover would correspond to increasing aerobic energy production, so that the time constant should be the same. And when you actually look at that fit, you know, that looks pretty good. However, when you apply the data to a large number of subjects, again, you get this this odd sort of wave going on in here, where the model clearly underestimates power in this duration, and then, of course, because like all of the other models, it predicts you're going to hit critical power and then maintain that forevermore. Matrix of the parameter estimates, Pmax and critical power end up being pretty strongly correlated here, when in fact you would think that they really should be sort of representing different things, right? One is a fast twitcher's territory, Pmax, and the other one is a slow twitcher's territory, critical power. Now, again, we're dealing with data in watts, so it could be a case of big people have high maximal powers and high critical powers, and small people have low maximal powers and low critical powers. But again, it does raise the question about whether the model has been correctly specified. And if you then try and look at the critical power that you calculate from the equation of Ward-Smith, it grossly overestimates somebody's sustainable power output. In fact, if you look at the critical power calculated using the model, it's so high I had to rescale out here. You know what their VO2 max is, it ends up saying that their critical power is higher than the power that you would associate with VO2 max. So it's clearly overestimating on the aerobic end of things, probably because it's underestimating on the non-aerobic end of things. The way that aerobic energy production is being modeled is what's really different about this Ward-Smith's equation compared to the classic Monod-Scherer approach. But the two have to add up to equal your power at any time t. So if the model, or as the model, underestimates your non-aerobic energy production, it's forced to overestimate your aerobic energy production. So again, looked good for that first blush, but not so good when you dig a little bit deeper. So what's a person to do? Well, you can also just punt and say, you know, I can't come up with any better model of the power duration relationship, so let's just look for a simple mathematical function that doesn't have any physiological correlates or significance behind it necessarily, but nonetheless at least allows us to smooth the data to eliminate some of the random noise. And there are various approaches that have been tried, but I thought I'd talk about this one from Pinot and Grappe because it's a perfect example of why you shouldn't put excessive faith in the scientific literature and the peer review process. Not only did they plagiarize me by proposing that you can look at somebody's power profile to represent their strengths and weaknesses and pretend that was a novel idea, But the paper that they put out, even on itself, is not all that impressive. Nonetheless, the reviewers apparently were, unaware of what's happening out there in the applied world, were naive to mathematical modeling, and they were able to get the paper published, and then the editors weren't willing to step up and do the right thing and force them to withdraw it. But to look at the way Pinot and Grappe approach things here, they simply propose that power at any time t is a power function. And that sounds redundant, doesn't it? But they're proposing that you start out at some p max, and then you decay as a function of time raised to a power. And you're decaying because b here, this exponent here, is a negative value. And you can already get a feel for where things are going here, right? It's going to overestimate your max power, and then it's going to underestimate, and then maybe it's going to be okay for a while, and then it's going to overestimate, and then it's going to be maybe okay for a while. And sure enough, that's what the normalized residuals look like. So obviously the model is biased, and we might as well just throw it out before going any further. And that kind of jumps out at you here when you look at the correlation matrix. Remember back when we had the simple critical power model with only 2 parameters, we were able to separate those two into critical power and W prime, and they weren't correlated between the two. Again, evidence that the model must be misspecified. So things are turning out to be rather short tonight, shorter than I anticipated, but that's okay. I'm sure your head's spinning already. The only conclusion you can draw from all of this, I think, is that none of the presently available models provide what I would consider a satisfactory description of the entire power duration relationship. And that's what I was really interested in, because if you're going to build a Parthenon to power-based training upon this foundation, then your model needs to be really robust. And if the available models won't work, and like I said, I looked at a lot more than just these, the only alternative is to see if you can develop a new model. So that's going to be the topic of next week's talk. And at this point, I guess I can take any questions from people.
Hey, Andy, and everybody, this is Tim Cusick. I'm going to moderate some questions. So if you have your questions, please feel free to type them in now. I've got 1 or 2 built-up ones, but I've been, again, keeping up with the questions pretty well, both privately and to the whole group. So, Andy, question number 1 refers to the AIS model. And here's the question. AIS model could be showing a method of finding fatigue of an individual versus statistical model, and therefore adjust the individual's training in that CP time frame.
Is there a question in there?
Yeah, it's funny. It has some question marks, but it really is more of a statement, I think, now that I look at it. Yeah, I think that's more of a statement of is it, and
well, there are lots
of way to use it.
Yeah, there are George Box. All models are wrong. Some are useful. Or as I put it, it's not a question of whether models are right or wrong. It's a question of what is their domain of validity. The model wasn't developed to try and apply it to the entire power duration relationship. So it would be unfair to criticize it on that basis. More what I'm saying here is that it's just not useful for my purposes because it doesn't fit the entire power duration relationship.
Excellent answer. I think that's actually an assumption being made in that question. That's a very good answer. Hey, could you go back to the Parthenon real quick slide? So here's a question somebody sent in. So if the underlying, I think I understand the question. I think you'll understand it better than me. If the underlying model is flawed, would the Parthenon be flawed?
Building on a house of cards.
Yeah, it really is
sorry,
that easy.
I thought I could jump straight to it, but you're going to have to put up with this. Yeah, you know, I would say the better your foundation, the better the longer your temple will stand up. Um, the better the foundation, the more robust the whole approach will prove to be. You can think of it in terms of, well, let's say we used let's say we just implemented the 3-parameter critical power model. And then we just plucked values for FTP using the 3-parameter critical power model. Well, as I showed you, jumping ahead here, you end up with a biased estimate of somebody's sustainable power, overestimating it for some people, underestimating it for others. Well, then that would have, to borrow a phrase from the Australians, that would have knock-on effects on any sort of training adaptation score that you tried to calculate from an auto-determined FTP. You can think of all kinds of potential issues that could crop up if the foundation upon which you've based all your calculations isn't as robust as it could be. Think of it in terms of rider phenotyping. He might phenotype somebody and label them a pursuiter when they're really a sprinter if your model is grossly wrong. So yeah, getting the power duration model as good as possible is a key step in what we have planned, again, for 4.0 and beyond, which is why that's where we're starting in terms of rolling out these new ideas, and also starting in terms of the educational process. 4 webinars devoted to it here, so people can understand the importance of this.
Excellent. And you actually answered the second part of that question. Do we have a better model? And I'll let you answer that question.
I answered that in the first week, didn't I?
Correct. Yes. I actually think your first slide made the point that is the point. Yes.
Actually, it was the second slide. The first slide in week 1 was something about the heartwarming tale of how the mean maximal power chart and power profiling met, fell in love, had a child that turned out to be somewhat of a prodigy. The second slide was implemented in WKO 4 as the most advanced mathematical model of the power duration relationship ever developed.
Yeah, and I was. Oops,
and then I said, that sounds like bragging, but as they say in Texas, it ain't bragging if you can back it up. So next week I'm going to be backing it up.
Excellent, and that's a point. I answered this question a bunch of times privately. Webinars 3 and 4 is where you'll be specifically talking about your model, the model housed within WKO 4, and then some applications and process. So everybody who's listening, the next 2 webinars are really going to dig into the specific solution. We got a lot of that question. All right, Andy, here's a couple more questions for you. One of the questions based on the answer you just were giving about the power duration model or having the correct foundation. So with all these different models, why not just use the appropriate tool that models the best for each time frame?
Yeah. I guess it's not necessary to limit yourself in that way. I mean, you think how you would have issues when you jump from one domain to another, or potential issues. That it might have been an approach. I mean, this is what it's sort of related to the 2-part model of cardiac glucose metabolism that I talked about in the first week, which is a model that is grossly over-parameterized with respect to the data, at least in terms when you consider the amount of noise in the data. So the only way to solve the model was to break it into 2 parts. Solve the model, a simplified version of the model using the early portions of the data, and then lock those parameter estimates down, and then solve the full-blown model with those as constants instead of variables. So that is a strategy that can be used in modeling, and if I had been forced to go that direction, then maybe I would have pulled that tool out of the toolbox. It didn't come up because I was able to come up with a robust model that works across the entire power duration time span.
Agreed. Excellent. I'm sorry, I'm answering some questions. Andy, one point, I got a lot of questions about Rs 3 and 4. I'll give you additional highlights. I'm just making the note. A lot of questions I received about normalized power. You guys, there's a lot of other in-depth questions about the accuracy of all these models and ways to question. I'm going to kind of shelve all those. We can try to get a frequently asked question out, but the point of the presentation at this stage, even though you probably have the absolute correct person to do it, and Andy, not me, but it probably would take a lot of time. I think Andy gave a good overview. The point is that there are some inaccuracies and problems, and he simply is showing that result reality.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I would emphasize to people is that you really want to distinguish in your thinking between different models. I mean, mathematical modeling is an approach, a mindset, a tool. We've applied it to, data from power meters. But while they're all models, at some level, things are totally unrelated to one another. For example, the performance manager approach. You could use any input function into the performance manager approach that you want to. You could use TRIMP, you could use TSS, or you could come up with some other score. You could use Bannister Session RPE and plug that into the performance manager. So the performance manager, it's a model, but it's separate from the input function. So normalized power and TSS, yeah, that's a theoretical construct, so I guess you would say it's a model, right? But it's separate from the performance manager. Along the same lines here, there's nothing on this Parthenon about normalized power because all of what we're talking about here is completely independent of the normalized power concept. So the normalized power concept could be, total bunk, and it doesn't really influence what we're talking about here. So you need to be able to draw those distinctions. Another very important one, think of the critical power model, which was first proposed for isolated muscle back in 1965, so almost 50 years ago. So W prime is a very old idea. More recently, Phil Skibba's published a paper where he's taken one of Morton's equations and rearranged it and then did W prime balance, which is comparable to what I was doing, at least conceptually, trying to do dynamic MAOD calculations back in 2007 when Alex Simmons asked me to look at some team pursuit data. But the thing you want to keep separate is that there's confuse or confound all of these different things together just because they all involve math and modeling.
Excellent answer. Okay, so let's wrap it up. I will tell you two final points. One, from the people who were continuing to ask some normalized power questions, I'll give you some insight. You have a little misunderstanding of exactly what normalized power does. So it's something that you might want to dig into your education a little bit more there. Someone asked a good closing question, so this is the last question I'm going to pose, and it's an interesting point. If someone has enough real data to cover all power durations, why do we need a model?
I can only assume that that individual didn't see the first webinar, because that was one of the things that I addressed. There are a number of benefits. I think I listed 10 on a slide to having a robust mathematical description of the power duration relation. Shape of that curve in terms of an FTP, a Pmax, a functional reserve capacity. You can then use those numbers to phenotype somebody. You can use the model function as your reference for individual adaptation scores. You can also, use it to spot outliers.
I guess that's it for us. Thank you, everybody. Please make sure you attend webinars 3 and 4, because Andy's going to really jump into the actual WKO4 modeling and power duration curve. Melissa, do you have anything to add? Okay, I think we're done. Good night, everybody. Have a great night.
Good night, everyone.